Failover Cluster Quorum didn't used to be that big of a deal. We used to just use a Quorum drive and be done with it. But things have changed so much in the days of always-on availability groups, asymmetric clusters where some members can see the SAN and some cannot. And it's way more complex with availability groups than it looks at first glance. What I'm going to talk you through is first, as a reminder, what are the differences between failover clusters and availability groups and when they work together, what Quorum is used for, what the two new features of Win 2012 and Win 2012 R2 are supposed to do, and what they actually do, which is a little bit different. And then we're going to take 3 common real-world scenarios and tell you how you go configure Quorum. So first off is Grandpa's active-passive cluster, aka a single instance cluster. When Grandpa built his cluster, he had it pretty easy. He had 2 servers and then a piece of shared storage, EMC, Hitachi, Dell, whatever. As long as the 2 servers could see the storage, that was 3 voters. But if one of these nodes died, as long as the other node could still see the storage, he kind of knew that he could stay in control. Whoever could still see the storage could stay in control. It's not that easy anymore because now we have always-on availability groups, which don't require shared storage. Yes, you can use always-on availability groups with shared storage, but you don't have to. So say that each of these has their own local solid-state drives. This guy up here is the primary. This guy down here is a secondary. Except the words primary and secondary only refer to the AG. You can have multiple availability groups in this picture. I could have, say, my accounting databases be primary up here and then secondary down here. And then my SharePoint databases might be primary on the bottom and secondary up at the top. At any given time, multiple nodes of the cluster can be primary for different things. This is an important thing to understand with clustering. There's no such thing as the primary anymore. And it gets way worse when you start to layer in failover clustering and always-on availability groups. Check this out. In this diagram, I have 2 SQL servers that can each see the SAN. Notice there's only 2 cables coming out of this storage. Only the top 2 can see my shared storage. And I have a failover clustered instance that can bounce around between these 2. I also have another SQL server sitting right next to it with local solid state storage. He does not see the SAN, but he's in the same cluster, the same Windows cluster, and he has an availability group. This guy up here at top is the primary in the AG at the moment. This guy is the secondary for this cluster. All of these are in the same Windows cluster, but they can be primary for different things at any given time. The whole reason I'm walking you through this is that I need you to understand how different primary is from whoever owns the cluster. Someone in Windows has to own the cluster at any given time, but it has nothing to do with who owns various roles of my SQL Server infrastructure. These 2 things are totally independent: cluster ownership and SQL Server ownership. There is no primary in the cluster that is primary for everything. Sure, jumping back a couple, in Grandpa's cluster, there was. This guy was the primary for SQL Server. He was the only one. He controlled the storage. But today, Microsoft had to design for something where that's not the case. In order to see how this works, what you do is pop open Failover Cluster Manager. Failover Cluster Manager, it's part of the clustering tools that are installed on the cluster itself. You can also install these on your own workstation, on any Windows server, or a jump box where you like to jump in at. Here I've connected to my cluster, cluster 01. And I'm looking at the nodes in my cluster. If you remember Toonsis the Driving Cat on Saturday Night Live, we have Toonsis and some explosions that are going to happen here through the course of today. So Toonsis the Driving Cat, we have Toonsis 01 and Toonsis 02. Both of my nodes are up, and both of them have a vote. Windows needs to control who runs the cluster at any given time, and I need a majority of voters up and running. And I can't have both voters thinking that they own the availability group. I can't have Toonsis 01 saying, I'm the primary, at the same time Toonsis 02 says, I'm the primary for exactly the same availability group. Oracle RAC allows this. SQL Server doesn't have anything that allows this today. As long as both of these guys have a vote and they can see each other, then they work together to figure out who actually owns the cluster at any given time. What happens when they can't see each other? When they can't see each other, I need a tiebreaker, because by default, 50% of the votes isn't enough to break a tie. By default, if I have two nodes in my cluster, one of them is going, when he can't see the other, say that Toonsis 01 says I can't see Toonsis 02, his cluster service stops. And Toonsis 02 likewise says he can't see Toonsis 01, his cluster service will stop. When I only have two voters, they're both going to gracefully shut down. I need some kind of tiebreaker. Microsoft saw this coming, so starting in Windows Server 2012, they introduced a couple of things in order to make this easier. Back in the old days of Windows Server 2008 R2, we had to install a hotfix, and then we could manually take someone's votes away. Like if I said, I never want Toonsis 01 to be the primary, I'm just going to take his vote away, then Toonsis 01, even if he's all by himself, will still hold the majority of voters. This is a crappy design. A much better way of doing this started over in Windows Server 2012, where we have dynamic quorum, and then Windows Server 2012 R2 made it even better with dynamic witness. And when you read the brochure, aka Books Online, it makes it sound like you can get all the way down to last man standing, meaning only one node up in the cluster, so you've got 5 nodes in your cluster altogether, that you'll be able to sustain multiple graceful failures, get down to just one node, and everything will still work okay. That's not how it works in reality. Let's explain how it works in reality. The first feature, the new feature in Windows Server 2012 R2, is dynamic quorum. So with dynamic quorum, I have Toonsis 01 and Toonsis 02. As long as Windows sees both of these and I don't have a witness set up, one of these nodes will automatically take away his vote. Say in this example, Toonsis 02 will voluntarily give up his vote so that we always have a tiebreaker. You can see this over in Windows Failover Cluster Manager. If I go click on the cluster, and then I go over into More Actions on the right-hand side, I can configure my cluster quorum settings. I'm going to go ahead and use the default. If I use the default and I don't change anything, Windows says, well, you didn't configure a witness, which would be a tiebreaker, something like a shared disk resource or a shared file resource. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and automatically take away someone's vote. You don't have to set anything to do this. It just happens automatically out of the box. Toonsis 02 in this case has voluntarily given up his vote. Now, I know what you're probably thinking is, why Toonsis 02? It just happens. It's not alphabetical. It's not based on boot time. These things just happen. And what happens if Toonsis 01 disappears right now? Say that Toonsis 01 is the primary in my always-on availability group. what if I simulate TuneSys 01 failing? In order to do it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect his network switch so that he suddenly drops offline. Then over on TuneSys 02, which is the node that's still up and running, he just didn't happen to have a vote. When I go try to open Failover Cluster Manager, it simply times out because the cluster isn't available right now. And on TuneSys 02, the cluster service shut itself off. This is happening at the Windows layer. This is one of the reasons why in larger companies, you tend to see the clustering stuff handled by the Windows team rather than the DBA team. As long as the cluster service is up, then SQL Server can start doing its business. But if the cluster service won't even start, we have bigger problems. In this case, it was because TuneSys 01 simply disappeared. If that happens, if Windows crashes, if we have a network partition, anything like that, Windows doesn't gracefully handle that. TuneSys 02 assumes that something is broken and he's all by himself. TuneSys 02 won't suddenly promote himself to having a vote because that's exactly how you get split brain functionality. If all you have is TuneSys, or if all you have is Windows Server 2012, this is the kind of scenario that you're looking at. You want something else. You want the ability to add a witness, aka a tiebreaker. It could be a shared disk witness, could be a shared file server witness. Fred says, is Win 2016 cluster functionality different than Windows 2012 R2? For the most part, it's identical. For everything that we're talking about in here, it's identical. It adds some stuff that doesn't really affect how we manage SQL Server. So for Dynamic Witness, this is the feature that was introduced in Win 2012 R2. Here, let's say that I have 3 nodes in my cluster. I have TuneSys 01, TuneSys 02, and TuneSys 03. If each node has a vote, that's 3 votes total. If I designate an additional file share as a witness, say whack whack domain controller whack file share, Windows says, well, I have the file share over there, but I don't need his votes right now. So Windows automatically takes away the vote for that file share. However, what you end up with in most cases is 2-node clusters. 2 nodes do need the file share witness as some kind of tiebreaker here. Windows is so awesome. It automatically figures out that, oh yes, your cluster only has 2 working nodes right now, whether this is due to TuneSys 03 failing or you just only having 2 nodes in your cluster, and it automatically assigns the witness a vote. Here's how you go configure that. Go into Failover Cluster Manager again, and we're going to go right where we were before, over into More Actions and Configure Quorum. Now this time, instead of taking the default settings, we're also going to select a witness. You would want to do this in Win 2012 as well. It's just much more important in Win 2012 R2 when we get the ability to dynamically have a vote flip on and off. After I choose that I'm going to select a witness, now I get the choice as to what kind of witness I have. This is where Win 2016 adds something else that's interesting called a cloud witness. It's not something that you want to use in SQL Server. So I can either use a disk witness or a file share. Disk witness is what Grandpa had, aka the Quorum drive. If you still have shared disk clustering, Quorum drive is fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's still the right way to go. If, when the SAN failed, your cluster would fail as well. Might as well just bring the whole thing down whenever the shared disk dies. However, if, like what we're doing here, an always-on availability group between 2 nodes, TuneSys 01 and TuneSys 02, I need some kind of independent voter, aka a file share. Now, what you use for your file share, you just want to pick the most reliable file server in the house. And also tell the sysadmin team, please don't reboot that file server without telling me first. Because sysadmins are very used to rebooting file servers. They have clusters, for example, and they don't really think anybody's going to notice when they do those types of reboots. They may also use Windows Distributed File Systems, DFS, you can't use those as a file share witness. It has to be just a plain old file share on a server somewhere. I used to tell people you should use a domain controller because they're really reliable, but then I realized that my sysadmins rebooted my domain controllers all the time. So not that. In here, I pointed mine towards Gates 1 because Gates 01 is very reliable. And then I just have a folder where I throw all my Quorum shares. All you have to do is type in this example, we're using the name of our cluster. During this configuration wizard, the wizard will assign all the right permissions to that file share. You don't have to do anything fancy there at all. Next your way through the wizard, and voila, down at the bottom of Failover Clustering Manager, you have a new cluster core resource. This is something else that needs to be up in order to keep the cluster up and running. So I have this new file share witness on Gates 01. What happens when Gates 01 goes away? Now here what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate a failure by going into Windows Explorer and right-clicking on that file share. I'm going to take away SQL Server's rights to see that file share. This is not something that would normally happen, but I'm doing it only to demonstrate a failure. You could see the same thing if the file share disappeared, if that Windows box where the file share was hosted disappeared, if you had a network problem between the cluster and the file share, you get the picture. I'm doing something crazy here, so Windows going to warn me, are you sure you want to take away permissions from somebody? After I do it, SQL Server still works fine. Remember, this is just a piece of Windows cluster plumbing. You don't even really see a warning inside SQL Server. But over at the Windows layer, I do see warnings. It's saying, danger, Gates 01 has failed. And this is a voting issue. If I go look in the event log, it says the cluster resource file share witness failed. Based on the policies, we may try to bring this back online. Remember, there's a voting issue here. I got to make sure that a majority of voters stays up and running at all times, which means I had 2 nodes and a file share witness. I had 3 voters altogether. I always need an odd number of people to have votes. So the file share just went down. I have 2 remaining Windows nodes in my cluster. What's supposed to happen now? Well, it isn't supposed to be this, but this is what happens. Both of the 2 remaining nodes have a vote. Even though I turned on the witness dynamic voting, even though we have automatic voting, adjustments happening here in this cluster, it's not working the way you and I would expect it to work. To examine what's happening, the easiest way to do it is to go use the PowerShell command get cluster log, which will tell me everything that's happened in the last, say, 30 seconds in here. And in here, if I look at this, warning, node weight adjustment not performed, cannot go below weight count 3, cannot go below weight count 3 in a hybrid config with 2+ nodes. What Windows is saying is, yes, I recognize that you have dynamic voting turned on. But I won't take away anyone's votes once we're down to 2. I'm not going to take away other people's votes. It won't even go below 3. So it won't let me get down to last man standing automatically. Whenever one of those 2 things dies, whenever one of those 2 servers die, I'm going to be down to just last man standing, and he will take himself out. He will shut his own cluster down, his own cluster service. So even though it looks like the file share isn't that big of a deal and that your cluster will continue to keep working even when the witness fails, you're now in a dangerous position. If anything else dies, the entire cluster's coming down. And I have so many funny stories of people doing this on Patch Tuesdays, speaking of which today is one of them. That on Patch Tuesdays, my Windows admins will reboot the file server because they're doing patches on that. At the same time, the SQL Server DBAs will reboot 1 or 2 nodes in a big cluster, thinking we've still got plenty of majority here. Next thing you know, the entire cluster takes itself gracefully down. So gracefully is the wrong word there. I have like a 10-second back loop going in my mind. Everything that comes out of my mind, was that exactly technically right? It was not graceful. It was a hard shutdown. Ugly. So how are you going to configure a cluster? There's 3 basic real-world scenarios that pop up a lot. First off is Grandpa's Failover Cluster. Grandpa's Failover Cluster still runs under Windows Server 2008 R2, and it's got a shared disk, aka the SAN. The shared disk Quorum is absolutely fine with this. You're not losing anything, because whenever the shared disk goes down, this whole cluster's coming down anyway. You can still be on Win 2008 R2, and it works just fine on shared disk clusters. But it fails spectacularly for AGs. If I'm running Windows Server 2008 R2, that means that I have 2 individual boxes, no shared storage. I need to point to a witness somewhere, like the file share witness. But if I lose 2 things, this cluster's coming down. I cannot get down to last man standing without doing some kind of manual intervention. Like if I lose the file share, I need to go manually start taking votes away from other people to make sure I can get all the way down to 1 vote. Things get a whole lot easier once you start building larger availability groups on a modern version of Windows, Win 2012 R2. In here, say that I have 2 nodes in my primary data center and 1 node in DR. Then I can throw in a 4th one so that I have a tiebreaker as soon as I lose 1 node. I can throw in a file share witness, and Windows will automatically take away votes from him and let me sustain another server failure as well. I can lose 2 members inside that scenario and still be working just fine. Big picture takeaways out of Quorum. This is one of the trickier things to set up when you're configuring your cluster for the first time. What you want to do is sketch out your infrastructure and then say, all right, what happens when this fails? What happens when this fails? How do I want voting to look under each of these scenarios? And then test it. Test it the hard way before you go live. Remember, test your unplanned failovers. Try simulating a network split between primary and secondary data centers and see just how many nodes you can still sustain. For example, in a lot of the availability groups projects I do, we have a rule that if you lose network connectivity between 2 data centers, no patching is allowed during that time window. Nobody's allowed to reboot a box because we may have serious cluster quorum issues.